Okay. Well, we are at 3 o'clock Eastern, 2 o'clock Central. Scott, you're Pacific time, so you're noon, right? Because
yep,
I'm not very
exactly.
good with the Central time, with the time zones, but great, fantastic. Thank you all for being here on the TMC Connect platform today. We are very glad that you're here. Just a couple of things to remember. You are coming in muted. Want to be sure that everyone has the opportunity to participate though. So if you have a question for Scott, please feel free to ask those in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will get those answered for you. Today we've got Scott Weintraub with MQMR, the URLA key auditing tips to ensure success. URLA is on the top of minds for everyone these days because of the impending go live date of March the 1st, and we want to be sure and answer all of your questions. So Scott, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. And with that, I am going to turn it over to you and let you get started.
Thank you so much, Tony, and thanks for inviting us to participate in the webinar today. I'm excited to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to have the chance to talk with all of you today about, as Tony mentioned, a critically important topic and one that is going to be effective really soon, and in fact, that some folks may already be using. So we're going to be talking today about the Uniform Residential Loan application, or Form 1003 as it's also known. And so again, I'm Scott Weintraub, the Internal Audit Manager for MQMR, and we'll be talking about the new Uniform Residential Loan application. So with that, I think, Tony, we can move to the agenda. Oh, that's me, and that's my contact information, which I think I'll mention again at the end. But obviously, if you have questions during this session, feel free to put them in the chat, like Tony said, and we'll get to at least as many as we can before the end of our time today. But you can, of course, feel free to reach out to me or us at MQMR anytime to help you with anything related to this webinar or any other needs that you might have. So here's our agenda for the next 40 to 45 minutes or so. We'll talk a little bit about why we're here today, a little bit of the history or timeline, and what is needed for the new loan application, the new URLA. And then we'll take a look at it. We'll talk generally and specifically about what are some of the key differences between the new version of the application compared with the current version. Spoiler alert, there are a lot of differences. And so we'll take a look at some of the key differences today. And then how can you be ready? So it's one thing to know that there's a new form, and even to know how the new form is different or changed from the current form. But how can you and your organization be ready to start using it by this mandatory effective date that we'll talk about of March 1st, which is just in a couple of weeks? Or how can you be ready if either your company or perhaps brokers, for example, who are sending you loans, what if they're using the form right now? We'll talk about that as well. And so then we also want to talk about how can you be successful with your internal audit, whether it's something you're doing internally or whether it's a company like ours that you partner with. What are some key areas that should be added to your testing and auditing program and protocol in order to make sure you're ready not only to implement this successfully, but to make sure that success continues post-implementation and going forward. And then at the end, again, if there are any questions, we'll hit as many questions as we can at the end. So thank you, Tony. So obviously, Fannie and Freddie chose to redesign the Uniform Residential Loan Application, the URLA, again, also known as Form 1003. So what was their goal? What was the goal behind the new application? Well, one of the things that Fannie and Freddie stated is their goal was to make it easier for lenders to capture some of the relevant information on the loan application. So, and again, that happens a lot. I think the goal is to make it easier for borrowers, and in this case, even to make it easier for lenders. One can debate whether or not they've accomplished that with this new form. But I do think, as you'll see as we go through some of the sections of it, it is easier to capture additional information from applicants versus the current version that had less of an ability to do that. But we'll take a look at some of the sections of the new form in just a bit. Another reason behind it was to capture the information for data collection and reporting for lenders to comply with the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which is known by its acronym of HMDA. And one of the things about the new form is that it makes it easier to capture the new and expanded fields of data and information that's required to be reported either annually or now perhaps quarterly by lenders, depending on their volume of loan applications. What does that mean? Well, between 2018 and today, or really by the mandatory effective date of March 1st, brokers and lenders, whoever would be taking an application with an applicant, has had to use two different documents to really complete the process of taking an application. There's the current version of the 1003 that everyone's been using, but then in order to capture the government monitoring information, or GMI, for example, the race, ethnicity, and gender of applicants, currently lenders and brokers are using what's called the Demographic Information Addendum. That's how they today have been capturing that GMI, the government monitoring information, and adding that document to the current version of the 1003. Once the new URLA or 1003 form begins to be used, then it will then be one form that can be used and not two. So again, that was another goal that Fannie and Freddie had, to be able to have one form to capture all of the information that's now required to comply with the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. So that was a bit of the history about how we got here. The form, the new 1003, as I'm sure a lot of you know, has been delayed several times before Fannie and Freddie reached the point where we are now, with the effective dates that we'll talk about in a minute. But we're here now, and so we want to make sure that you can be ready for the mandatory effective date and for success going forward. So next slide, please, Tony. Thank you. Oh, one back, there you go. Thank you. So when I talk about the effective date, what are the dates that we need to keep in mind? Well, one of the things is, I suppose, if there's anything more confusing or complicated than one effective date, it would be two. But that's what we have here. It's, of course, complicated enough whenever there's a new law or rule that changes what we need to do, because at any point in time, when something new becomes effective, there will be loans in process on that date, which brings up the question of what do you do about loans that are in process? We will talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. But for now, what are the effective dates? Well, again, there are two. The first effective date is January 1st, 2021, which, as of course we all know, that date is already passed. So that is called the earliest effective date, which means that was the earliest date that a broker or lender could, if they wanted to and felt ready, could begin using the new Uniform Residential Loan Application, the new version of Form 1003. So for any application taken from between a loan officer and an applicant on January 1st, 2021 or after, if a broker or lender wanted to and felt ready, they could use the new application form that we will be taking a look at in just a bit. But you don't have to. It is not mandatory. So right now, literally right now today, we are in a period where two different versions of the application form are allowed to be used. You could be using the current version that's been in effect prior to this new version. You could be using the current version, or you could be using the new version. And again, we'll talk in a little bit about what that means for loans in process and what it means depending on what form of the application is used. So right now, it is possible that if a lender or broker wanted to, they could be using the new version of the application form. Well, when do we have to use it? That's the mandatory effective date. That date is March 1st, 2021, only a couple of weeks from now. So for any application taken on March 1st or anytime after March 1st, it will be mandatory to use the new version of the 1003 of the Uniform Residential Loan Application that we'll take a look at again in just a bit. So between now and March 1st, either form could be used. But starting on March 1st, the only form that will be allowed to be used is the new form. It will become mandatory for all applications taken on March 1st or after. Next slide, thank you. And so when we think about the new 1003, the new version of the application, how is it different? And so the answer is it's different in pretty significant ways. One of the biggest ways that I would say the new version of the application is different from the current version is, as you can see here in this chart, the sections are in significantly different orders. So for example, on the new version of the application, section 1 is the borrower's information. On the current version that we've been using, the borrower information isn't provided until section 3. To go over just another couple examples of how it's different, for example, the property and loan information is in section 4 of the new version of the application. It's in section 2 of the current version. And what is called the demographic information is in section 8 of the new version of the application. It was in section 10 of the previous version, whereas there is no identified section 10 in the new version of the application form. There's a section about military service in the new version of the application. There is not a section specifically designated for military service in the current version of the application. So I think that's one of the biggest things that jumps out to me, or that would jump off the page, if you will, when looking at the new application. It is organized differently in terms of the order of the sections and the information that will be provided. Why is that important? Well, I think it's of particular importance to your loan officers who will be taking applications, or your brokers, if you're wholesale, who will be sending you applications, and to your operations staff who will be reviewing these applications once the loans are submitted. And what I mean by that is the form will look quite different than the one they've been used to. And so what will be important is to make sure that they've seen the new form, to see how it's laid out, how it's organized, how the information is provided in the sections, and to make sure when information is being entered into your LOS system, that it's been entered properly, and that the data and info is in the right place, that it's mapping to the right sections where it needs to be, and that the information that's required is in fact being captured and stored in your LOS for use, both for the loan and originating the loan, and for reporting it for HMDA purposes, and for any uses that you might have. So again, the two forms look pretty different, and we're going to take a look right now at some of the new sections. So thank you. One thing before we get there, one of the other key differences about the new version is what to do if there's more than one borrower. So if there's one borrower, it would of course be simple. That one borrower would complete the new version of the application form. Where the differences come in under the new rules with the new form starting on March 1st, when it becomes mandatory, is what happens if there are 2 or more borrowers. So if there are 2 borrowers, there's different rules depending on whether they're using joint financial information, such as a married couple, for example, or 2 borrowers with separate financial information. And so as you can see here, in either case, if there are 2 borrowers, there would be the Uniform Residential Loan Application, the new application that the primary borrower would complete. And then there is a separate Uniform Residential Loan Application dash additional borrower. And in a couple slides coming up, I'll show you what that looks like. But there is an additional borrower form that must be filled out by each additional borrower. And then as far as how the information is reported, the assets, the liabilities, maybe other real estate owned for the additional borrower, that can either be filled out on the original URLA, or there can be a separate one filled out for each borrower, and they can provide all the information. If if there's two borrowers and they're using separate financial information, starts out the same thing. The primary borrower would fill out the URLA, and then there would be the additional borrower form that the second borrower would complete. And again, same rules, you can report the assets or liabilities on the additional borrower, or there could be a completely separate form for each borrower. If there's 3 or more borrowers, again, you'd be able to use any combination of the loan application and the additional borrower form, similar to what you'd use for 2 borrowers, again, depending on how they would want to report their assets, liabilities, depending on if information is jointly financial or separate. So the key point here to remember is that there's an additional form that must be filled out for each additional borrower. So there can't be just one form, one URLA to be used completely for all borrowers. There has to be that additional borrower form filled out by the second borrower or third borrower, etc. Okay, next slide, thank you. Okay, so we've talked about it a lot already. So we've talked about the new loan application. We've talked a little bit about, in theory, how it's different, organized differently, laid out differently than the current version that's in effect now. So now that we've done that, let's start taking a look. Let's start taking a look at some of the key sections of the new application. Okay, so no better place to start than the beginning. So this is the first page that your loan officers or your brokers and your applicants will see either now, if there's anyone who's using the new form now, or certainly starting on March 1st or after, when this becomes mandatory. So this is page 1 of the new uniform residential loan application. And so as you can see, it starts off with section 1 for borrower information. And so you guys, of course, can take a look at this. Hopefully you've all had a chance to look at the new 1003 already. But in case you haven't, I wanted to point out a couple of key things to note with the first page, with this first section. Number 1, there is a citizenship section where the borrower can identify themselves as either a citizen or a permanent resident alien or a non-permanent resident alien. And as we know, there are certainly requirements and eligibility consequences or results based on how an applicant identifies themselves related to citizenship or permanent residency status. So there's a way right there, right up front, for a borrower to identify that. Then there's also here a nice clear section for type of credit, where an applicant can indicate I'm applying for individual credit, just myself, or I'm applying for joint credit, and a place for the borrower to initial. So that's right there. Another thing I wanted to point out is on the new application, there is an opportunity to gather and obtain more contact information about your applicants. So there's home phone, cell phone, work phone, email. So there's a lot of additional information that you can capture, which of course will make it easier for you to be able to contact your applicants as you go through the process and as you go forward. The other thing that I would say is that at least one thing that jumped out to me is that the new version of this application form, the fonts are a bit larger. I think it's laid out a little bit in a clear way with some bolding and how the sections are. I think that your loan officers and brokers and applicants, for that matter, will find this form a little bit easier to see. I think it's a little bit better visually. But again, the biggest differences about it is how some of the information is laid out and how it's ordered. So again, this is the first thing an applicant and your loan officers or brokers would see, starting with section 1. So thank you. And then from there, continuing, there's a section there, section 1B, to talk about the borrower's current employment status, or if they're self-employed and their income. So again, I think there's some nice clear headings and sections that would alert your loan officer and would alert the applicant to know where am I putting in that information. And then I'd also point over here to the gross monthly income. There's ways for the applicant to break that out: base pay, overtime pay, bonus and commission, and what they earn per month, if any, for all 4 of those categories. And then also obviously information about where they work and the contact information. So again, I think laid out in a way that might make it a little bit easier for both the loan officer and the applicant alike. So next, thank you. And then I skipped ahead a little bit to show you section 4. So here's the information where there's loan and property information that would be provided by the applicant. And it again talks about the purpose of the loan, the property the applicant wants to purchase or perhaps refinance. And it starts right out here. What is the loan amount? What is the amount that the applicant wishes to borrow? And is it a purchase or a refinance? Here's the address. And then there's a clear question related to the occupancy as well, primary, second home, or investment, or if it's an FHA secondary residence. And then there's some questions here. Again, easy yes or no questions. And then there's a section right underneath that for any other new mortgage loans on the property that the applicant might be buying or refinancing. And then also obviously a section for any rental income. So it's in a different section. It's in section 4. But again, I think it's laid out pretty clearly and understandably, at least hopefully, for applicants to be able to enter in the information about the property that's subject to the transaction, as well as the loan amount and the purpose of the loan. So that's section 4. Okay, here is the new section 8 for demographic information. And so again, the good news about the new version of the application form that again will finally be here and mandatory as of March 1st, the date we've been talking about all afternoon. The demographic information will now be collected within the same form. So instead of having to use that demographic information addendum that has accompanied the current version of the 1003 for the last couple of years now, it's all going to be contained in this form. And so as you can see, there is the disclaimer language right at the top that talks about why we're collecting, or why you as a loan officer is collecting this information from the applicant to help make sure we're all preventing discrimination. And then here's the categories for ethnicity and race and gender here at the bottom left. And again, it not only gives the applicant the opportunity to identify an ethnicity and a race, but for certain of those categories, it gives them an opportunity to further identify themselves. And again, this information was all part of that addendum that's been separate from the application for the last couple of years. It's now again embedded within the application form itself. And so you can see if an applicant were to identify him or herself as Hispanic or Latino, there's some choices, and along with another if they wanted to type something in. Similarly with race, for some of the racial categories, there is an opportunity for the applicant to further identify themselves as to how they would choose to identify him or herself. And there is gender, and for each category, there is still the option for the applicant to say, I do not wish to provide the information. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, the same rules still apply, that if the application is taken in person, right, face to face, even if the applicant chooses not to provide the information, the loan officer would still need to fill the information in. And so how would they do that? Well, there are these questions at the bottom. If it's a face-to-face application and the borrower chooses not to provide the information, those boxes would be checked. But then the loan officer would still fill the information in based on two factors: their visual observation of the applicant and the surname, the last name of the applicant. And there are questions here to ask if any of the above, the ethnicity, the gender, or the race, was collected based on visual observation or surname. And if that was the case, then the loan officer would answer yes. The other point that I would want to make sure that all of you know, if you don't already, is if an application is taken with the loan officer and an applicant through the use of FaceTime or Skype or some mechanism where the loan officer and the applicant can see each other, that counts now as a face-to-face application or an application taken in person, even though the two parties aren't in the same room. But if it's done that way, FaceTime, Skype, or whatever, if the loan officer can see the applicant, that counts now as a face-to-face application. And so the information would have to be collected even if the borrower chooses not to provide it. And then again, it would be done based on that observation and the surname if it was done by FaceTime or Skype. So there's a lot there. Most of this was true before this new effective date of March 1st, but all this information now will be embedded into the same new application form. So that's section 8. Okay. So this, I just wanted to point out, is the Uniform Residential Loan Application Additional Borrower. And here it is laid out exactly the same. So basically the same type of form, but again, if there's more than one borrower for a loan, they would need to fill out this additional borrower form. And so if there were 2 borrowers, then for example, your sales staff would want to make sure they're getting that filled out from both applicants. And then secondly, from an operations perspective, when a loan is submitted and an application comes in and there are 2 borrowers, for example, 2 applicants, then your processor or whoever's the first person looking at that application once it's been submitted will want to make sure that there's this additional borrower form if there is a second borrower on the loan. So I just wanted you guys to see what it looks like, how similar it is to the application itself for the primary borrower, but that this would be needed if there is an additional borrower for the loan.
Hey, Scott, we do have a question that came in the chat, and it deals with applications. So I wanted to be sure and ask you before we go on to the next section.
Sure.
When you say application, do you mean the TRID application or just the borrower submitted credit request pre-qual?
That is an excellent question. I'm glad you asked. So what we're talking about today, when we say this application form, we are talking about an actual application for a loan, an application for credit. So one that would trigger TRID, the requirements for initial disclosures, such as the loan estimate. So in other words, if a consumer is coming to you and they're asking only if they might be able to be pre-qualified or pre-approved for a loan, that is a different thing. That is a preliminary step that would not necessarily trigger an application that would require this application form to be used. So again, part of it depends on what the communication is between the consumer and the loan officer. That's very important to know what might trigger an application. But I would say generally, in response to the question, if a consumer is only inquiring about whether they could be, for example, pre-qualified to get a loan if they chose to apply for one, then this application wouldn't have to be filled out in order to be pre-qualified. But again, if they're intending to apply for credit and have a decision made on if they could be actually approved for a loan, this application form would need to be filled out.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you, Jessica, for that fantastic question.
Absolutely. Really important topic. Okay. I think I'm ready for the next slide, Tony. Okay. So now we've talked about how we got here, right? How Fannie and Freddie redesigned the application form and how it merged or sort of meshes with the new HMDA data collection and reporting requirements that have been around for a couple years. We've also talked about, well, we know there's this new form, but what does it look like, right? How is it laid out? How does it differ? How does it compare and contrast with the current version of the application? And we've looked at some sections of it. So now that we've done that, what do we, when we think about ourselves as lenders, mortgage companies, lenders, brokers, what do we need to do to make sure we're in full compliance with the new application requirements that, again, are mandatory starting on March 1st, but also that some lenders or brokers out there may be using right now? And so I want to talk about that. I want to talk about what will happen on March 1st, particularly with loans in process that were applied for prior to March 1st. And the way your company can be sure that they're in full compliance is to use the notes here at the bottom of the slide. Your people, your technology, your resources, and your testing and auditing programs and protocol. So ready for the next slide? Okay, so The first thing that I want to talk about is training. It's obviously crucially important that your staff is trained to be able to know what the new application is, again, what's new or different about it, and how it can and must be used. One of the things that I'm sure all of your companies will be doing, if they haven't done it already, is making sure that your systems are up to date. So for example, when it's March 1st, the application form that will be spit out of your system is the new one, the correct one. As great as that is, it's equally important to make sure your staff understands the new rules, understands the new form, and how they can answer questions, whether it's operations staff answering a question maybe for a loan officer, or how a loan officer can answer a question that an applicant might have on the new form. So in order to get this right, in order to make sure that you're fully successful with this, as you can see on the slide, there are a variety of different departments within your organization that need to be trained and up to speed on the new application. So one place to start, for example, is with your compliance department. Obviously, anytime there's new legal and compliance regulations, you want to make sure from a compliance perspective, there are people that have the expertise on the new rules. The reason for that is so that they can be a resource and answer questions that sales or operation folks may have, or even, for example, that your IT folks may have to make sure the systems are being updated correctly and compliantly. So you want your compliance department to obviously be well-versed in the new rules and the new application form. Then your loan officers or your sales employees, they will be out there using this new application form with their applicants. So of course, they're going to want to make sure they know what's new and different about the form and how they can be a resource to answer questions from applicants who will be filling it out with them. And then thirdly, your operations staff. They will be reviewing the application form from the time the loan is submitted by the loan officer. And so they'll need to make sure they know what they're looking for and where it is on the new form, and to make sure any information that's put in the LOS, that's put in your system, is accurate, matches what's on the 1003, and it's the right information and it's in the right place so that it can be captured correctly. Well, then the loan will move to underwriting. And there's obviously information on the 1003 that the underwriter will use when underwriting the loan and making that initial credit decision. So you'll want to make sure that they're well versed as well on the new application form, where the information is within it, so that they're using the right information when they're underwriting the loan. Similarly with closing and funding. There'll be, for example, an application form that could be part of the closing package, right, for the borrower to sign at closing, and to make sure that that's in the file, that it's the right form, and that it's filled out completely and accurately, so that at the end of your process, the loan is fully compliant with the right and accurate uniform residential loan application. And then, of course, your IT department. A lot of this information, or all of it really, is captured in your system, including the form itself being spit out of your system and the data that goes from the form, that's on the form, capturing that data in your LOS, moving that along as you go through the process of originating the loan. And so at the end of the day, you have that data not only for an accurate loan file, for the right loan for your borrowers, but that you have the right, accurate, and up-to-date data to report, again, to comply with HMDA. So if you look at this, it really is a big circle of departments that work together, that collaborate together to make sure your company is in full compliance with the new application form. Again, it's not every day that a form is seminal or integral to the origination process changes, like it's happening here with the application form. And again, really from a borrower's perspective, it's one of the first forms they fill out, right? The application to get the loan. So can't really think of a more important document. So within your organization, there's a variety of different departments that will want to be well-versed on. Okay, well, and so how do you make sure that happens? Well, in addition to having training, putting some training materials together and training your staff, what else can you do? Well, another thing you can do is to make sure all of your relevant and appropriate policies and procedures are updated. And so I've listed here several different types of policies and procedures that could and would be impacted by this change with the loan application. So for example, any compliance policies you have, or your compliance management system document. And even fair lending, because obviously the government monitoring information that's collected on the application through the application form is used for your fair lending data analysis. So all of these should be updated to make sure it's known that as of March 1st, the new version of the 1003 needs to be used. Any policies and procedures you have related to loan applications, taking an application, obviously needs to have mention of the new version of the form. Your operation staff, your processors who will be looking at the application when the loan's submitted. Any policies and procedures related to their process should be updated to reflect the new form. Underwriting as well. The information that the underwriter uses that is captured through the application form, you'll want to make sure that your underwriters know and that their procedures are updated as needed to make sure they're capturing the right information from the right place. And then, of course, for your HMDA data collection and reporting policy and procedures, obviously a lot of that information comes from information that's on the application form. And so that's another area where the application is referenced and where you'll want to make sure that there are updates to note, again, as of March 1st, that new version of the form is being used, or even earlier than March 1st, if you were one of those companies that have already started using the form. And again, we're going to talk about that in just a bit. So a last point to think about with policies and procedures. A key focus of internal audit, a key focus of your internal audit program should be to be reviewing your policies and procedures, at least on an annual basis, to make sure that any updates that are needed have been made, and that they're reviewed and approved again by your senior or executive management or your board of directors, if there is one. And in addition to doing that annual review, anytime there are changes to laws or regulations, you need to make sure you've gone through the process of looking at your P&Ps and saying which one, or ones, plural, do I need to update? Next slide, Tony. Okay, and then secondly, so we talked about people, training your people. We've talked about updating policies and procedures. We also want to talk about your systems. Obviously, you should be making sure your LOS has been updated to ensure that data has been captured correctly, and that that data, even though it's a new form, that data is still mapping correctly to the appropriate screens in your system, so that you have it for the loan. Again, for HMDA reporting, data would likely map in your system from one screen in your system to another screen for HMDA reporting. You want to make sure all of that is still being captured accurately. And if things are updated throughout the process, that it's still being updated accurately. And so here's a tip. You don't want to rely solely on your LOS. So what types of things should you be testing? We can talk about that as we get to the next slide. Okay. So again, how do these changes affect your internal audit program? So one of the things we talked about earlier is look at how many different departments changes like these touch. So, one might think, well, the new application form, that's for loan officers when they take the application with the borrower. So is it really just loan officers that need to know about this? Well, clearly the answer to that is no. Many more people and departments within your organization need to be well versed on these rules, because that information from the application form carries through all the way down the line with that loan and with your process. So again, when you think about internal audit, you want to be thinking about all of these different areas, your policies and procedures. What is your change implementation process when there are new things that happen like this new form? Your training for employees, what systems and controls you have in place, as well as loan file testing. Actually looking at loans, are we following our new policies and procedures that we've updated? Are we complying with these changes? Next slide, Tony. Okay, so how can we help you? I mentioned a little bit ago about what are some of the things that you can be testing. Well, one thing is, we talked about there's this mandatory effective date of March 1st. Again, just a couple of weeks from now. There's two things that I want to add on to that. One is there are some lenders or brokers who may be using the new version of the form right now. That's okay, because again, there is that earliest effective date of January 1st, last month. So as long as you see on the application that the application was taken on January 1st or later, it is okay if the new application form was used. It is also okay if the current form is being used. So what does that mean? That might mean your company is in a situation right now where you could have loans in your pipeline with 2 different versions of an application, right? For loans with applications from January 1st or after, there could be some perhaps with the current version of the 1003, or there could be some with the new version. So that's really important for your staff to know. There could be some companies out there thinking about this date of 3/1, but the date really could be now. It could already be a situation where there's some new versions of the form coming in and maybe some current versions of the form. So your pipeline could have both. And you'll want to make sure that your staff knows that for now, that's okay. Come March 1st, there is a different reality, right? What does the reality mean on March 1st? Well, it means 2 things. First, on March 1st, any new applications on 3/1 or after, there's only one choice. It must be the new version of the application if that application is taken on March 1st. But as we know, and as I mentioned towards the beginning, anytime there's an effective date like a March 1st, there will be loans that are already in your pipeline where the application was taken prior to March 1st. Those loans might still have the current version of the 1003, not the new version, because the application was taken prior to March 1st. That is okay, right? As long as the application was taken prior to March 1st. On March 1st or after, the applications must use the new form. So again, what does that mean? It means your company will need to be equipped from a systems perspective and a staffing perspective and a question answering perspective to deal with 2 versions of the application at the same time. And so when you think about testing or auditing loans, that's an important thing to keep in mind, that there could be 2 different realities of the type of application that you get, even on March 1st or after, because you'll have loans in your system that were applied for before March 1st. Those loans will close, though, after March 1st. And when you go for the final 1003 for closing for those loans, if the current version was used, not the new version, because the application was before March 1st, you'll want to make sure that you stick with the current version all the way through. You can't switch. Similarly, if there's lenders or brokers using the new version now, right? The application was taken, let's say, February 1st, using the new version of the form. You can't switch to the old one by the time you get to closing. You have to stick with the version of the form that you used. There can't be 2 different versions of the form in the same file. And again, once we get to March 1st, only the new version can be used. Now, again, the last point I would make about this, again, with these 2 realities, it's really important when you're looking at your loans that the right form is being spit out of your system. So for example, if an application was taken before March 1st and you're using the current or what will soon to be old version of the 1003, and that loan is going to close on March 15th, for example, and your system spitting out the 1003 to be signed by the borrower at closing, it needs to be the current or what by that date would be the old version of the 1003. When changes like this have happened in the past, I can tell you from experience, there have been some systems that would only spit out the new version, when there are some situations where the old version would need to be used, even though we're after the effective date of March 1st, because the application was originally taken before March 1st. So that's, again, a big thing for you guys to keep in mind when looking at loans while they're still in process, and certainly when you're going back to audit loans afterward. I think the last point I would make about that is there really isn't a cure for using the wrong application form. So again, it's really important to get it right the first time. And so hopefully this training, I think, has given you some ideas for how we can help you with that. Next slide.
That's it.
That's it. So with that, I'm certainly happy to hang around if there's any questions. And again, Tony and Amy, thanks so much for allowing MQMR to have the opportunity to help our clients and to help everyone out there in the industry climb higher. And again, I'm Scott Weintraub. If any of you have any questions about this now, we can take some, or following it, my email was in the beginning of the presentation. I think we'll send something out as a follow-up. We'd be happy to have a conversation with you about any of your needs. So Tony, thanks again for having us on.
Thank you, Scott. This information was incredibly detailed. We really appreciate it. Appreciate MQMR being part of the TMC Connect platform. I did have a question going back to the process when you said that if there's multiple borrowers, then there's an additional form that needs to be filled out for each of those additional borrowers. And but you said that the asset piece of that can either be put with the original form or with the additional borrowers. Does the company need to be consistent in how they complete that, whether they're putting it on the original or with the borrower, or can it be dependent on the loan?
You know, Tony, that's a great question. So here's what I would say. I think it's really two answers, but there's going to be one I recommend more than the other. So technically, is there a requirement that every loan a company does have to be done the same way? There isn't. But I would suggest that a company ought to be consistent. So what I mean is, I think it would be easier for both sales staff, certainly for operations staff, if a company wanted to have a policy that said, we'd want, in theory, all the assets to be on the one application as opposed to separately, it might make it easier. The only caveat I have with that, Tony, is it's possible there could be some applications where the two, especially now in COVID times, where the two applicants might not be in the same place. So it might not be possible for both of them to fill out information on the same form. It might have to be two completely different forms. Or for example, a company could have a policy where they want it to be on two completely separate forms, right? That might be easier. That might be a better way to have it all be the same, perhaps. So not a technical requirement. I would say, what I would say to any company out there is for them to try to see and have procedures that would hopefully be as consistent as possible, but to make it as easy as possible for their staff when the loans come in.
That makes sense. And then of all of the information that you've shared with us, you know, it's all important and it all needs to be prioritized. And I might have missed it. What's the day that this goes live? I'm not sure we talked about that.
I'm going to go with March 1st, mandatory effective date.
What's the biggest takeaway? What's the number one thing? If you had to really focus and key in on one thing, what would that be?
Yeah, great question, Tony. I think it's where are you right now? And so it's a two-part. I think the second even more important than the first. The first is, what is your company's situation right now? Whether you're retail, are you using the new version right now? And if you are you sticking with it all the way through? Or if you're getting loans from brokers, what versions are they using right now? Are you getting all the current or soon to be old version? Or are you getting some new ones, or both? And if you're getting both right now, if that's the situation you're in, then I'd suggest you have something you want to do right now, which is to make sure your folks have a handle on the fact that it's okay right now to have two different versions, as long as for each individual loan, only one version is used. That's part one. Part two is, what do you want to do first thing right out of the gate on March 1st? Well, you obviously want to make sure that all new applications on March 1st or after are only using the new form. So anything coming out of your system is only the new form on March 1st or after, or anything you might get from a broker where the application date says March 1st or later has to be on the new form. That's A. But B, you also need to be thinking about, what about our loans in process that were applied for prior to March 1st? That might not close until later in March or maybe even in April. Those might have had the current, or what would then be the old version of the form. Those loans, you need to make sure the old form continues to be used all the way through closing. So again, there will be, and it's unfortunate whenever there's new laws like this, but there will be a dual reality starting on March 1st. And so companies need to be prepared for that.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for your time. Thank you everyone for coming to TMC Connect and joining us today. If you've got any questions, Scott's information is here and there will be a follow-up. This is being recorded and you will receive an email with a link to the recording for our YouTube channel. And once again, we really appreciate it. Take a look at our member engagement calendar on the TMC website for all of our upcoming webinars, and we hope to see you again here very soon. Thanks so much, Scott.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Tony.
it.
Bye, everyone.
Have a great day. Bye.
You too.